is an Episcopal priest, associate professor of Christian spirituality at Southern Methodist University Perkins School of Theology right here in Dallas, Texas. He has authored a book with a fascinating title, The Dave Test, subtitled A Raw Look at Real Faith in Hard Times. Dr. Schmidt, welcome to today's Issues.
Thanks very much. It's good to be with you.
Tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and then tell us about the title of your book and what it means and the story behind it.
Well, as you said, I'm an Episcopal priest, and I'm also an academic. I've divided my life largely between the academy and the church, and have been actively involved in both. And my wife and I have 4 children who are all grown and ostensibly on their own, and 2 grandchildren and 2 more on the way. And the book, The Dave Test, is a book that I wrote arising out of my brother's almost 8-year-long struggle with brain cancer. My brother was an orthopedic surgeon, and he was a hand specialist. And at one point at the end of a day's surgery, as he began washing his hands almost 9 years ago now, he had a visual episode in which all that he could see were images from earlier in the day. And he chalked it up to eye strain because he had been operating on 120 patients a month, and hand surgery is very visually demanding. And he thought that the vacation he was on his way to would cure that problem. It didn't last all that long. But then on vacation, he had the same experience again. And he came back to Nashville, where he lived and worked, had an MRI run and discovered that he had a brain tumor, and a very aggressive brain tumor at that. Had surgery 2.5 weeks later, had a second surgery almost 7 years later, and in between had chemotherapy and was on a drug trial that helped control his disease to some degree. But the cancer never left him, and then January of last year, on his way back from the basement, he had a stroke or a seizure and fell and hit his head on the concrete floor. And that resulted in a traumatic injury that led to his death 4 days later. And the book is, The Dave Test, is really about his struggle to find people who could be companions with him in that hard place, and is written really for people who are in hard places or are trying to be available to people in hard places, whatever the cause, be it unemployment or illness or loss of any kind. And it's 10 questions that you can ask yourself and discover answers to that can make it possible to be available to others and can make it possible spiritually to navigate life's hard places yourself.
Well, that's a terrific introduction to this book. And I'm looking at the table of contents right now, and there are 10 questions here. Don't have time to cover all of them, but let me just ask you about one of them, because it's a great question. Can I avoid using stained glass language? What do you mean by that?
Well, when I was visiting with my brother, he and I spent a lot of time together during the time of his illness. And at one point, I asked him early on, I said, I'm not taking attendance and I'm not trying to find faults, but are you going to church these days? And he said, honestly, no, I'm not. And he didn't for quite some time. He eventually did start to go back to church. And one of the explanations he gave for not going was he said, I grew up in the church. My brother was Southern Baptist. And he said, and I understand the language that the church uses, and I understand the language that it has to use to describe God's work. But teaching I hear never connects it with real life. It never explains the connection. So he said, people will say to me, your illness is a blessing in disguise. You're going to be a greater blessing to other people as a result of this. And he said, and yet people never really explained to me how that can possibly be so. He said, with my education, I was able to help 120 people a month. And here I am in the 50s with a use-by date stamped on my head, and I don't understand what that means. And so what I mean by stained glass language is using the language of our faith without ever really connecting it with the realities of our life. We almost hide behind it and fail to unpack it.
We're talking to Frederick Schmidt, Schmidt. The Dave Test is the title of the book he's written, and it's subtitled A Raw Look at Real Faith in Hard Times, published by Bendigon Press. And where do people get the book, Pastor?
Well, it's available. It's available directly from the publisher. You can find it using the title or my name on Amazon or on Barnes and Noble, or you can order it at your local bookstore, and I'm sure they'll be able to get it as well.
You mentioned. So I have a question for this. Is basically you're talking about things like cancer, losing your job, I guess divorce. Right. I mean, losing a child, all kinds of things that are real life, and they're the hardest parts of life, right. And then how to deal with those. That's what you're covering in this book. You mentioned how sometimes Christians, your brother experienced this, and I've seen this, and we probably all have, and they're well-intentioned people, but they say trite, cliche, things at times when people are suffering, and they're supposed to make people feel better, but so you just covered that to a certain extent, but then you also cover, you say tips for what to say when you can't seem to find the words. So we know maybe warning people against, don't just throw out you're a blessing with your disease, things that people tell us what we should say.
Well, I think that among the things we can say is we can say God grieves with you. I think of the picture of Jesus' care for people in hard places that you read in the Gospels, and it's the image of God with us, the image of God as the one who understands the experiences that we're having, and who grieves with us first. And I think that it's important to remind people that that's the case, to remind people that God can hear their struggle and that they can be honest about the struggle that they're having. Certainly the psalmist is a good example of this. Many of the prophets express their agony at what is happening in their lives and in the lives of those around them. And that kind of honesty, I think, is another thing that we can affirm when we talk to people. I think, too, we can tell people that although God is not the architect of our suffering, that we can find a hope and a way forward by giving ourselves to God in the middle of our struggle. And it's a very different thing to invite people to give themselves to God in the middle of life's hard places, as opposed to saying, well, God brought this on you. And then, of course, there's the thing that everyone needs, and that doesn't really amount to words. It amounts to the willingness to be present with people who are in hard places.
Yeah.
To give them a hug and to remind them they're loved, which I think God uses to encourage us as well.
Absolutely. Excellent advice on this topic. The book is called The Dave Test, and Dave was Frederick's brother who passed away, and Frederick learned a lot from that time with him during his brother's suffering, and written about it in this book, The Dave Test, a raw look at real faith in hard times. Fred, thanks for being our guest. We appreciate it very much.
Thanks for inviting me. Have a great day.
You too. We shall return momentarily